Hi, in this video we're going to talk about parallel arrays or parallel lists. So you've seen what lists are. In this case, we are going to see how to keep track of related lists that have a correspondence. For example, students' names and their scores. So they're two separate lists for all intents and purposes, but conceptually for us, we need to be able to keep track of the name associated with the score. So for example, if I sort this list by name, which means Amit moves over here, Amit's score also has to move over to position 0. And if Mary moves over to position 1, then Mary's score also has to move to position 1. Okay, so that is something the user, the programmer, needs to keep track of. So that's what we call a parallel list. When you add, when you move things around, when you search for Priya, then you find Priya's name in position 2, then you go look in position 2 in the scores list for the score. That's what we mean by corresponding lists, okay, parallel lists. And so let's take a look at this code. I have code here that builds these lists, and prints them. Okay, so in main, if you start here in main, we have two lists, names and scores, and they are empty right now. I have a variable called entry equals initialized to yes that I use to enter my loop. I call the intro function here, which jumps to the intro function and prints the message. And while entry equals yes, it is yes to get my loop started. I call add item and I send names and scores, which are my empty lists, to this function. We come here to add item, takes names and scores, which are empty, initializes a variable, a string variable called name, an int variable called score to read a single name and a single score from the user. So I read a single name, I say enter student's name, I enter a single score, I convert it into an int because it's an integer, and I put it into score. You can use a float if you wanted to, it doesn't matter. Then I take the single name and append it to my names list. Now, most common error the students make is to call this variable the same as the list name. Do not do that. Give this variable a different name. Give this variable a different name. They are different from the list. This is an individual name that gets added to the list. This is an individual score that gets added to the list. So they both get added, and then I go back, the function ends, I go back here, and entry equals more entries gets called. More entries is a function, we jump to this function, that asks a question to the user, do you want to add more names, yes or no? The answer, yes or no, goes into entry. I check, I do data validation, input data validation to make sure that they enter yes or no. I convert it to lowercase, and check for y or n. If it is something other than that, I say invalid, which is a good thing for you also to do. And then I say, do you want to add more names? I ask them again. Enter the right letter, right answer. And I return that. The print is just a blank print statement. I return whatever the user enters, entry, back to where this function was called, and that goes into entry. So we are receiving it, an important concept of value returning functions, right? You receive it into something. Then we go back to the while. The while is something that keeps repeating until this condition becomes false. It checks to see if entry is yes. If it is yes, then it goes in here, adds the next name. And I will show you in a minute how this code works. And we keep doing that. When entry is no, it comes out and it prints the lists. Okay, and the print list function is right here, where we take the names and scores. And I get the length of names, I get the total and average, I print some header information, I go through my loop for index and range of length. By now you know the for loop. Index starts at 0, I print names at position 0, I print scores at position 0. I add the score to total. Total is a cumulative total. Every time, notice these two statements are inside the for loop. I go back, index becomes 1. I do the same thing for position 1. I add the score to total until I reach the length, which is the end of my list. Then I come out of the for loop, I average total divided by length, and I format it to 2 decimal places and print it. One thing to notice is from my add item, notice as I appended things to my list, I didn't return the list. How does it go back and how is it filled in main? Lists are special objects that when passed to a function, you don't need to return them. They're automatically getting filled in main. That's called pass by reference, where the lists are passed by reference and you are actually appending to the list in main and you don't have to return them. So here's how code looks. This is a replit, and let me show you my replit screen. Here's the code for that program, the same code here. So if you run this, see how it works. It says enter student's name. This is where this is coming from in my add item. It gives me the intro message and then it says enter student's name. So let's enter some name and a score. It gets added, goes back, calls more entries. It's in more entries right now. It says, do you want to add more names? If I say anything other than Y or N, it is going to say, oh, that's not valid. Enter Y or N. I can enter uppercase Y and that'll work. And oh, that didn't work. So say yes. And let's add more names. Yes. And say no. And it prints everything. Okay. So take a look at it. That is the concept of parallel lists. Now, once you have that down, go on to the next lesson where we have very similar code, but this lesson talks about multiple parallel lists, not just two. For example, a shopping cart, item, quantity, and cost, right? You can keep track of multiple things, not just two things. So these are the three lists, and here is the end receipt. This is the end sample run as to how the program looks. And here's a starter code for you to start with and do exactly what I did in my other program, but we are working with three lists and there are some functions that have been written and you just need to add things to this function and see how it works. So try it out, and that is all about parallel lists.